You might think the best place to start with New Testament history is the birth of Jesus. And that's pretty close, but let's set the stage a little bit because the events of the New Testament do not occur right after the close of the Old Testament. The last book of the Old Testament is most likely Malachi, written at least 400 years before the birth of Jesus. The time between the Old and New Testaments is called the Intertestamental period. Jesus was born in the Roman Empire, but the last empire in control of the Jews in the Old Testament was the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. So, what happened? In a word, Alexander. Alexander the Great, the aptly named military man, conquered the Persian Empire, ushering in the beginning of widespread Hellenization. But Alexander died at age 32, and the aftermath was messy. You may have heard of the Wars of the Diadochi. There was no clear successor to Alexander, so the potential candidates kind of duked it out. Eventually, it came down to three kingdoms, the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, and the Macedonian. And of those, of course, it was the Seleucids and the Ptolemies who had and fought each other over control of the land into which Jesus would be born. Most of that time, the Jews enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, as they had under the Persian Empire. But that all changed about 167 BC under one Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Seleucid king who greatly persecuted the Jews, banning and defiling their religious practices. By the way, this king, Antiochus IV, is likely prophesied in the book of Daniel, though he is not mentioned by name. So because of his actions, there was a revolt that became known as the Maccabean Revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus. They went to war against the Seleucids and were successful. In 165 BC, they reclaimed and rededicated the temple, which is what Hanukkah commemorates. After that, and possibly because of a treaty that the Jews signed with up-and-coming Rome, the Jews would again have some autonomy under what is known as the Hasmonean Dynasty. Now, Judas Maccabeus himself was killed in battle, but the Hasmoneans were relatives of his who became successive leaders of the Jews and Judea. They had their ups and downs, but around 63 BC, a Roman by the name of Pompey, who was a member of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Crassus, sieged Jerusalem and took control over Judea. Thus, the New Testament would take place under Roman jurisdiction. Historically, that is the bridge between Malachi and Matthew. Well, a few beams of the bridge anyway. But what about culturally? A lot happened during the Hasmonean period, and a lot of different worldviews emerged. In today's America, we have conservatives, we have liberals, we have varying degrees of extremism, and sometimes there is political and religious overlap, sometimes not. Well, similar things were happening at the beginning of the New Testament, but it was the Pharisees who had emerged as dominant. The Pharisees' main focus was in keeping the commandments of the Torah. They saw themselves as something of enforcers of the common people. The Sadducees were upper echelon aristocrats who were regularly at odds with the Pharisees. While the Pharisees emphasized the oral word of God and also the traditions and commentaries based on it, the Sadducees were strictly concerned with what was written. The Essenes were more withdrawn. If you were to find a monk during this time, it would have likely been an Essene. They valued communality, and they sought not to seek wealth. Most modern scholars believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the famous manuscripts found in 1947, were written by the Essenes. And the fourth philosophy, known as the Zealots, were extremists whose goal was to purge the land, particularly by overthrowing Rome. And this was something that everyone wanted, but the Zealots thought it was their specific duty to restore Israel using force and violence if necessary. One of Jesus' apostles is called Simon the Zealot. The last thing to mention is the language. The kingdom of Israel spoke Hebrew, but that began to diminish as soon as they were first exiled. Aramaic became the language of the Achaemenid Empire, so Jews learned and spoke Aramaic. But when Alexander the Great took over, Hellenization ensued, and so Greek became the dominant language. And even though Rome was in control at the time of the New Testament, Latin was only used for official purposes usually, so most of the empire retained their language, which was mostly Greek, but the Jews had been more resistant to Hellenization than many other areas, so they mostly still spoke Aramaic. Now, a good Jew would have known Hebrew because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, of course, and many of the Jews also would have known some Greek, even if they didn't speak it at home. So, to summarize this summary of intertestamental history, the Greeks ended up conquering the Persians, and the Romans ended up conquering the Greeks. Jewish culture managed to remain intact, although there were several movements that did not see eye to eye. I'm Pastor Clinton. May the God of wisdom increase your understanding of His Word.